Hello, thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the author of The Missing Hours, Julia Dahl, in conversation with Andrea Pino-Silva. I'm Morella, the Events and Social Media Coordinator here at Flyleaf Books. And before we begin, if you have any questions during the event, please put them in the chat or in the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and I'll ask them towards the end of the evening. You can find out all about our other virtual events by clicking on the link at the top of the screen. If you would like to make a donation to Flyleaf Books to help us continue to bring great programs like this one to you in the future, please click the donate button down below. And also, if you would like to support tonight's author and Flyleaf, we have copies of Julia's The Missing Hours available for purchase on our website. You can also buy it over the phone, browse our shelves, or click the buy button down below. And now I'd like to welcome our guest for tonight's event. Julia Dahl is the author of Conviction, Run You Down, and Invisible City, which was a finalist for the Edgar Award for Best First Novel, one of the Boston Globe's Best Books of 2014, and has been translated into eight different languages. She's also a former reporter for CBS News and the New York Post. She now teaches journalism at NYU. Andrea Pino-Silva is a public scholar on issues of global gender-based violence, media framing of violence, portrayals of gender and sexuality, and the Latinx identity. Also, narratives of survivorhood. She's a policy and media strategist committed to bringing together grassroots organizations and radical storytelling to build intersectional and accessible social movements. Starting August 2021, Andrea will be starting her doctoral studies in American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, pursuing research on the framing of gender-based violence survivor movements and global community-led solutions to violence. I'm going to minimize myself now so we can focus on the guests for tonight's event, but I'll be back in about 40 or 45 minutes to get the Q&A portion going.
All right.
Wonderful.
Hi, Andrea.
Hello, thank you all for joining us today. So what was not clarified in the introduction is that Julie and I have known each other for almost 10 years now.
Almost a decade, yeah.
Which is interesting to think about. So I'm a doctoral student at UNC in American Studies. But before my doctoral studies, I was an undergraduate where I filed a Title IX complaint against the university. So at the time, in 2012, campus sexual violence wasn't really a conversation. So when we filed our complaint in 2013, it created a national media landscape to talk about this issue in a way that was beyond just our individual cases. So a lot has happened in 10 years, but it's really great to be back in conversation with Julia, specifically about a book on, in some way, campus sexual violence. Things have in many ways come full circle, which is really something to think about. So in your previous books, you've written about murders in the Hasidic Jewish community. What made you want to engage with this topic, with campus sexual violence? Maybe the obvious?
Maybe you, partly you. Thank you, first of all, for doing this. I really appreciate it. It is really weird to think that like we met almost 10 years ago and now you're back doing a PhD and I'm writing a book about this. I don't think my first book had even come out when I interviewed you, but that's how we met, is that Andrea and another student, Annie Clark, filed a Title IX complaint against UNC, and I was working for CBS News, and I read about it, and so I went down to Chapel Hill and interviewed them and did a story and a short sort of segment on them, and we all just kind of kept in touch. I was really impressed with them and the work that they were doing, and it's true that back then, you know, obviously campus sexual assault has been going on since there were campuses, but it was not something that really anybody was talking about. I mean, you know, there was sort of a conversation around like, this is bad, but not a conversation around like, what can we actually do to try and get our hands around this and make it safer for students. And I had been reporting, and that was what, 2013, is that right? I think
yes,
so. Yeah, 2013. But this book, so as you asked, you know, my previous books had been about murder in the Hasidic Jewish world, which is very different. But all my books had been inspired by articles that I had written as a reporter, right? And this book, The Missing Hours, was also inspired partly by your story, but even before that, I reported on a story out of Steubenville, Ohio, back in 2012, I think it was, of a young girl, so a high school student, even younger than you guys were, who got drunk at a party and was assaulted by a couple boys, and they took pictures of her and video, and they sent it around, like all around the town. Football players, the whole town kind of had seen these photos. The girl didn't remember anything. And I reported on this story. You know, after a year or so, there was an actual court case, and two of the young men involved did serve some time. But I could not stop thinking about this girl and what it would have been like to, first of all, be the victim of that kind of violence. But then, you know, to have it compounded knowing that other people, that these pictures of you at the most humiliating, low, traumatic point in your life were being passed around to the community, and that I couldn't stop thinking about the idea that she, for the rest of her life, would never know if somebody she was meeting had seen those pictures of her in that moment. And that just, like, I mean, even thinking about it now, like, just gives me chills. And I thought about a lot about that, but I also thought a lot about her family, right? Like what does that do if that happened to your sister, or that happened to your daughter or your cousin, like, or your friend? Like, what does that do to you, and what does that do to the community? And so even though that's like 10 years ago, I kind of couldn't stop thinking about it. And I knew I wanted to write a story that began, as The Missing Hours does, with a young woman waking up, knowing from how her body feels that she's been assaulted, but having no real idea what happened.
Yeah, and I will say that for, I don't know a single person who hasn't had that moment, who's experienced sexual violence, even those that know who the person was that did it. There's an immediate feeling that your body isn't the same, right? And I think that, again, you talk about Steubenville, I also will not forget Steubenville. I mean, the Steubenville case happened the same year as my assault. And, there were just so many cases that were in the news. But among the things that I found to be really frustrating, that also was a reason why I came forward, was that these cases were framed as being episodic. This is a huge issue with crime reporting, which I'll ask you more about later on. But, what it means that we look at these cases of sexual violence as being isolated, as being, conditional to what a person did to deserve it to themselves, and how if the person who did it is to be actually believed as a perpetrator, then they must be objectively nefarious, or the person wouldn't know what they were doing, right? So I pause on that to think about Claudia as the character, right? I think that, we are taught that victims should look a certain way, that they should be, objectively a good person, preferably white, religious, straight, blonde, even more so, this type of victim that we see in the media, that we see as who is the person who should be protected. That's not who Claudia is, and I think it's really interesting that you frame her as, and in some ways, an unlikable heroine. But I ask, did you even intend to make her seem a heroine, and was that actually the point? And why did you create her that way?
That's a good question. Like, did I intend her to be a heroine? I didn't really. I intended her to be the main character, but I don't think of her as a hero or a heroine, because none of us are really heroes or heroines, like, in totality, right? Like, maybe we do something good or heroic occasionally, but yeah, I wanted to make her somebody who was not that easy to feel sorry for. She is wealthy, she's privileged, she's white, she's educated, she's beautiful, she's all these things that it's sort of easy to be like, oh, she got too drunk, sorry. She uses her sexuality, like that's sort of what part of her background is, that she's like got all these Instagram followers and she like posts bikini pictures and stuff. And I don't know, like it's easy to sort of judge that and to be, but honestly, like if you're 19 and hot and you want to post bikini pictures, like, who am I to say you can't post bikini pictures? Like, well, there's nothing wrong with that, right? And yet she knows the minute. And so I wanted to make readers recognize that even though she's not a saint, but you don't have to be a saint to deserve justice, right? Like, it doesn't matter if we think she's a little bit too out there with her sexuality, or we think she got too drunk, or maybe she wore a short skirt. Like, none of that matters. None of that is the reason she was assaulted. She was assaulted because there were rapists around when she happened to get drunk. And this was something that I thought a lot about in the last few years, as I was reporting on cases like yours and a lot of other cases. Yours was different from this, but a lot of the cases that you hear about, like in Steubenville, is young women who get, really intoxicated. And of course, that's something that happens a lot early in college, right? Like, you're just out of school, you're just out of your parents' house, you have access to alcohol, but you don't really know how your body reacts to alcohol yet. So, you have a few drinks and you realize, and then all of a sudden you're on the floor, right? And frankly, that happened to me multiple times, but I got lucky. I happened to be around men who were not rapists, right? And I wanted to sort of talk about that. I also wanted Claudia to know, and this is something that sort of has changed, I feel like, from even the time when you and I when we did our interview, is that Claudia now is, 19 in 2020, right? And she knows, the minute she sort of recognizes what happens to her, she knows enough to know that nobody's gonna believe that she was assaulted. And that even if she went to police, nobody's going to take her seriously. And I think that, like, even 10 years ago, a lot of women thought, like, well, okay, I'm going to go to the cops and everything's going to be fine. And I think now, fortunately and unfortunately, I think that, like, we have brought into the light the idea that it's not that easy, right? That a lot of young women understand that it's not going to be easy to sort of, quote unquote, get justice from the justice system. And so Claudia recognizes that and is kind of like, well, I need to get my justice, or at least try some other way.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because this hyper focusing on what a victim should look like. It's so prevalent in our society, and it's not just men who tell us these things. I think some of the people who are often the worst are other women who tell victims that they should have acted differently. But just like you said, the worst thing that Claudia should have experienced from having a drug out is a really bad hangover. Right. Maybe seeing a paper or a quiz, right?
Right. Using her phone or something. Yes.
Not a life-altering harm to her body, right? And I think that when we think about it that way, when we think about what the consequences are, like the justifiable consequences are for something like underage drinking,
right,
it certainly shouldn't be sexual violence.
Right.
And I think that should be something that we would all agree on. But it's easier for us to think that sexual violence happens to people who make mistakes, and not that it's as prevalent as it actually is. Right, and I think that is the bigger issue that we have here, is that if we are to come to terms with how prevalent sexual violence is, then we have to come to terms that it can happen to anybody, including ourselves, and that it can be perpetrated by anyone that we know.
Yes,
and that is a much more difficult thing to come to terms with.
Right.
To just, blame it on somebody for making a mistake.
Right.
Because you can do all the right things, and yet this will still happen to you because it is a person who did this to you and not something you did onto yourself. So in that same vein, you spent a lot of time looking at this issue from the perspective of different narrators, particularly her family. Oftentimes sexual violence is framed as, solely an interpersonal problem. It's oftentimes a narrative between the victim and the perpetrator, which comes across a lot in crime reporting in particular. But you made a point, to look at how the impact of this crime changed Claudia's family, and not just her family, but her community. Why did you choose to do that? And was it something that maybe came from your experience in reporting and what you saw as a gap in the way that these cases were usually covered?
Yeah, I think, like, it was so clear to me when I sort of thought about it as a person who has, best friends and a sister and, close family, that when trauma happens to somebody, it doesn't just stop with them, right? Like, there's in a way that this has become a little part of the zeitgeist, because one of the big movies of last year was that movie, Promising Young Woman, right? Which, if you have been the victim of sexual violence, I do not recommend watching. But I watched it in part because I knew that it was something going to be like about what I was talking about. And that's about a woman who kind of goes rogue after her friend has been the victim of sexual violence. Like the way that violence ripples out beyond the one body that it's been perpetrated on is definitely something that I've reported on when I report on sort of community justice and restorative justice, and the way that communities can come together with, after, not just sexual violence, but gun violence and sort of larger violence against whole communities. When the community can heal together, it's a much greater sense of healing, because you forget that, and I feel like this became a big deal, or became something we talked about a little bit with racial violence last summer with George Floyd. It became like so much clearer, and we started to finally read stories about how just being a person of color, specifically a Black person in the US, is trauma after trauma, because you're watching people that you love constantly getting hurt, and that traumatizes you. And I think that it's just kind of not something that we think about a lot, is that like second generation trauma, right? And I really wanted to write about that because I do feel like often violence is like written about as, oh, she was the victim of a crime, but her whole family is going to be changed forever. I mean, when something like this happens to a family, it's like 9/11 in their family. Nothing is ever going to be the same. And I wanted to explore how like everybody's going to react differently to it. Like not everybody's going to react well. They're not going to like all do the right thing and, come together necessarily. And that trauma is going to screw people up. So I wanted to, I did want to dig into that. And I think, you've read the book, like there aren't really, like the book doesn't give you that many answers to like, here's how you should behave, or here's the best way to deal with this trauma. I think, what I wanted to do was just sort of pose a bunch of questions and have people live with those questions a little bit.
Yeah, and I will say that I think it's I think a lot of folks, especially when they read fiction, they want a very clear answer, right? Of what one should pick up as a lesson, what not to do, what to do. And the truth is that there is no universal response for how to endure the impact of sexual violence, particularly as a person who's a secondary survivor of that violence.
Right.
You never know what the survivor is going to want, right? I always say that the first thing you should tell a person who tells you that they've been sexually assaulted is that you believe them, and that they are not alone, and that it's not their fault. And those three things can oftentimes completely change a person's life. And that's because it's very rare that a person is going to have a great first response, because there is so much of a pressure to kind of try to figure out what happened, to try to get the person to get justice right away. But the thing is that justice looks differently for every person.
Right.
Oftentimes, much of the frustration of their community, you immediately want to find the person who did it, or you might question what they did. How could you have gotten drunk? How could you have put yourself in the situation? But really, the most that you can do, to be as supportive as possible, is to quite literally listen to someone and believe them. And that should always be the first step. Obviously, assuming that the person is not in immediate danger, which in some way, Claudia went through periods of being in immediate danger, but in the end, the support from her family was there. Whether it was perfect or not, I don't think is really the point. But I think in many ways her family was there in their own way. One of the things that I saw really present in the book is much of the discomfort of me, and probably to a lot of readers, is how much time you spent in the minds of the young men in the book, and not just the perpetrator, but the men across her community. Why did you do that? Was that something that you really wanted to get across, that you could only do by using that type of plot device?
I had never so I'm married to a man. I've been living with him now for like almost 15 years. And I have a son who's 6 years old. So as much as, I grew up with a sister, I didn't grow up with boys, and I've always, before that, I'd always had like female roommates. I lived alone. I consider myself a feminist. My best friends are women, but my best friend really is my husband. And then I'm raising this boy. And so more and more I started thinking about so because of that I have in the last few years, especially since having a little boy, have started thinking more about the male experience. Like, what is it like to be a guy in America today? And just a guy in general, what's different about the way we're socialized and the way we live and what our expectations are. And partly I wanted to do that because I love in thriller mystery novels, I love getting the point of view of the bad guy, right? I do think because at some level there is no, there's no Satan on earth, right? Like there's no absolute core dark black bad guy. There's always like a little bit of complication in the guy who does the terrible wrong thing. And I feel like that's important just as a writer to complicate things a little. Like nobody should be so easy as to be like always easy to be bad. So I wanted to write that, but then there were, and so, there are two kind of pretty bad guys, the father and son in the book, and they come across as pretty bad. But there are two other guys, one of the perpetrators, who I wanted to complicate a little bit. And I think when you and I talked earlier, we talked a little bit about this idea that like there's one kind of guy, a bad guy who would commit a sexual assault, right? As opposed to a guy that a lot of us look like, or that maybe we know, and that in a certain circumstance with the certain trigger could commit this kind of violence. And like that is the truth, right? The complicated, ugly, scary truth. So I wanted to talk about that. But then the other so I wanted to give those, like the bad guys, a voice. But more importantly for me, the book is told mostly from the point of view of Claudia and her sister, and Claudia's sort of dorm mate, this guy Trevor, who she just sort of literally runs into. She'd never really known him before. And Trevor for me was a really important character. Because I really wanted to explore sort of the difference in male and female sort of, not morals exactly, but sexuality a little bit, especially at that age of like 18, 19, 20, 21, where you're just sort of getting involved in like having sex, and it's a big part of your life, but you're also really trying to figure out kind of who you are all over, what your values are, what your, how you treat other people. And Trevor, in a way, stems from a conversation I had with my husband years ago when we were just, talking about men and women and being young and, our experiences with sexuality as young people. And I remember him saying something like, that it was confusing for him as like a teenager, basically, where like understanding what women wanted from him. Like that he was like, women, girls want me to be gentlemanly and hold the door and hold their hand and send flowers, but they also really like the bad guy, and they like the bad guy a lot, the bad boy. And he was like, so which am I supposed to be? Am I supposed to be one sometimes and one and another time, and like trying on those different hats and seeing how that felt. And I had never thought of it that way, like that is a confusing thing that sometimes. Bubba, oh, my son just walked in. Sweetie, you okay? You want to say hi real quick? Hi.
I want to see.
Okay, sweetie, you can't. You have to go find Daddy. Sorry, guys. So that's the one I'm raising, and I want to raise him, good like his father, to be thoughtful and to be moral and to be kind. But there's a lot of confusing sort of ideas thrown at boys, just as there are thrown at girls. And mostly I've written about girls and about women. And I really wanted to give Trevor a voice and give voice to that kind of complication. And that's sort of why I made, because Trevor, the minute he meets Claudia, he realizes that something very terrible has happened to her, and he wants to help her. Like, he legitimately is like, this is a person in need, I want to help her. But he is also hopelessly attracted to her, and he kind of can't help that. And like those two things happening at the same time are really confusing and weird to him, and feel awful. Like, so, and again, there's like no right answer, but I wanted to explore some of that in the book. And that's why I gave the men so much time.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, right? Because again, like there's these whole tropes of what a rapist, what a murderer looks like, right? Which I do think that we are getting some more, compelling looks now. in fiction, just in general in Hollywood, and more about what those people look like. And I think a lot of Gabby's case is in the news right now.
Yes, I know this has been coming up a lot, right? This is such a perfect case to talk about.
And what it means that her boyfriend got to go home, and that no one seemed to ask questions, that she wasn't with him. And of course, as more and more reporting has come out, is the fact that she had gone to the police, the fact that she had told people, but it never seemed bad enough, or it was framed as just another lover's quarrel. And
or it was framed as she's having a mental health breakdown. Like, instead of she's being abused, she's anxious and depressed or something. Like, the way women are infantilized by that has been making me really angry the last couple of days.
Yeah, and the thing is that Gabby's case is getting so much attention, in part because she is a white woman, in part
pretty and white and blonde. Yeah, exactly.
She fits this persona. But what I'm not seeing enough of in the news is the fact that her boyfriend is this pretty white boy.
Exactly.
That in many ways, the way why he is still missing, the reason why there is no clear path towards justice, is because he doesn't look like the version of an abuser that we are told is what an abuser is.
Right.
So this is, I think, a good follow-up to my next question. Is I think that a lot of people say, which I've been told many times, isn't it just obvious that we tell survivors to go to the police, which of course we talked a little bit about earlier. But I think it's so important for us to continue to push on this trope, and just how many survivors are told that it doesn't really count until you go to the police, or this person's out here doing it to other people. Like, it always comes back to
it's your responsibility to catch them. Yeah.
And it's interesting because Claudia is not a Black woman, but what does it mean that survivors are told to go to the police, and we are not talking about police brutality and state violence against women survivors, right?
Yeah.
The fact that we still consider the police an option, and we're not addressing how police perpetuate harm in communities of color is in itself a problem that needs to be explored, and has been explored by scholars. But I think in your book, you were very clear, even with her looking the way that she did, even with the power and wealth that she had, Claudia didn't go to the police. And I think it's really interesting because she's the type of person who likely would have had a better experience.
Yeah, right.
Not that it would have been good, but it likely would have been better, right? So the fact that you did that, I think it sent a very clear message pretty early on that wasn't the story that you wanted to tell. You didn't want to tell the Olivia Benson saves the day story.
Right.
There isn't a clear path to justice.
Right.
What do you hope that readers take away from the way that you didn't engage the police?
Right.
The way that your path of justice.
Right. Like that. And that came straight again from my reporting, like even talking to you and Annie, like you reported in the, back in college in the way that you sort of thought you were supposed to. You went to the university, and it was wildly unsatisfying, right? It was doubly traumatizing because you were treated in a way that was not thoughtful or sensitive of what had happened to you. And I remember, like, right after I interviewed you guys, I did another series of two, and I interviewed two women who'd been sexually assaulted, and they lived in Washington, D.C. And they were talking about how they went to the police, and the way they were talked to and treated by the police officers was more they were like, this is more traumatizing than having been assaulted. I can't, like, and so they dropped their cases, and they were like, I'm not going through this again. Like, I'm not going to be, I'm not the perpetrator here. I'm not going to sit for hours and hours of probing questions after you've already probed my body in like such a, in such a evasive way. And, it's funny. So like, I have not been the victim of sexual violence, thank God. And I still think, if I was, I would go to police. And I think a lot of women who haven't been the victims of sexual violence, it's easy for them to sort of go, well, of course I'd go to the police. I would want I would want justice, right? And I would love, like, I wish there was some way to do some kind of study of women over the course, like before you're a sexual assault victim, would you go to police? And then once you've actually been victimized, how does that change, right? Like, would you actually go to police? I wish there was some way to like figure out how to do a study like that, because I think, now having spoken to so many people who've gone through this, I would think twice about going to police. Certainly, I would think twice if I'd been drinking, or if I knew the person, or if I God forbid, invited him into my car or my home. Like, I would know enough to know, because now I've talked to enough victims, and frankly, enough people in law enforcement, enough prosecutors, enough defense attorneys, enough investigators to know that of the, first of all, we know that most sexual assaults are not reported to police. Of those that are, the number that end up in some kind of like quote unquote satisfying, outcome, where I'm not exactly even sure what satisfying means, but I guess it means the guy's in prison for a long time and everybody believes you, is like vanishingly small. So even if you decide to go to the police and you submit yourself to hours and hours and hours and months of questions, and then get on a witness stand, at a grand jury and at a public trial, and you tell your story over and over and over and over again, the likelihood that a jury is actually going to convict this person is so low in this country. And Claudia knows that. And honestly, I think a lot of women know that. And I want it to get better. I mean, I think that I've talked to a lot of prosecutors throughout the country who are doing this work and who are saying, like, I know that it's going to be hard to convince a jury, but I'm going to try anyway, because if you don't try, then it's never going to get better. And there are prosecutors doing that, right? And there are police agencies that are training their agents to talk to sexual assault victims in a way that makes sense and that is like trauma informed. But it's like not enough. And so it ends up being, the woman is the victim, but her body is also the crime scene, and it's all on her. It's all on her to like make this happen. And, I don't know, like, I'm not here to tell you like how I can make it different exactly, but I knew enough to know, I know enough about the criminal justice system to know that it's not easy to get justice. And I think, and I think Claudia knew that too.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because this whole theme of justice keeps coming back in our conversation. I think so much about what justice looks like, or what an ideal case looks like. And it's something that I was in conversation with a friend a few months ago. And I said, I realized one day that what the criminal justice system does for survivors is that it prepares you to be a witness at a trial. That's about it.
Right.
Then, and that's if your case is even prosecuted. There are no systems for long-term mental health care, long-term physical care.
Mm-hmm.
If you happen to be pregnant after the assault, there certainly isn't
Right.
going to be comprehensive dependent care. If your job or your education is interrupted, there certainly aren't going to be programs to prepare you for a future career. So these systems in place to care for a survivor, they're not there.
Right.
So even
right.
if
You're lucky if there's like a single victims advocate that works at the police department, who has 800 clients that she's trying to like get in touch with.
Exactly. And the truth is that a person like Claudia would have access to a therapist,
Yes.
but many would not. Right. So, so again, I come back to what justice looks like, and I think so much about the recent arrest and the murder of Faith Hedgepeth. Faith Hedgepeth was murdered literally only a few months after my assault, and only a few months before we filed the complaint in 2012. And she was a year younger than me. And I will tell you that the impact of Faith's death has been felt since the moment we knew about it, and to this day. An arrest, and certainly not a conviction, are going to heal the harms of her absence, because justice will not bring her back. I can't speak for her family. I can't imagine what her family is feeling right now. But I think so much about what it means that we focus on a justice, that one is whether or not we believe in a carceral state and an incarceration more broadly. So much of this response is not on caring for the survivor. Totally. And caring for their community. Because again, it's not about, Faith is not here, but her family, her loved ones, her dorm mates, people that knew her, they were also impacted by her absence, by the sexual violence that she endured, and she did not survive.
Yeah.
Right? This system will not be able to repair that harm. So in your years of reporting, what have you learned about what justice could look like?
I just laugh.
Survivors,
right.
And what you've learned from survivors, right? Because I think it's in my own scholarship, I am really interested in survivors and in their communities, because we focus so much on the crime, we focus so much on the punishment, but I don't hear enough about what survivors, like how we are able to endure, right? And what keeps us going the next day, right?
I mean, I think so. The best example I can think of from my reporting is I reported on right after Hurricane Katrina. I was living down in Georgia, and a bunch of people, they sent a lot of people who had lost their livelihoods in New Orleans to Georgia, and I was writing for 17 magazine, and they had me they basically were like, can we profile somebody who survived Hurricane Katrina? And I found this young woman named Taisha Martin at a church in my town in Georgia. I interviewed her. I profiled her. She'd had this crazy story of, she lived in the 9th Ward. She was separated from her daughter and her mom. She had to swim, and she was airlifted from a roof after 3 days. Anyway, I wrote a story about her. And 4 months later, I got an email from her sister, who I'd also met, saying that Taisha had been murdered in Texas. She'd been shot in the head and left in a ditch. And that was in 2006. She was a Black woman. This is when I really started to recognize, oh, wow, if you're a young woman of color in this country and you're killed, the likelihood that your perpetrator is going to be convicted is less than 50%. But I'd never encountered that in my life, right? I knew somebody as a teenager who was murdered, but his killer was found, and there was quote unquote justice. But I don't know enough about his family. But Taisha's family has no justice. The justice system has completely failed her family in every way. And I think that I'm not in close touch with them, but I am in touch with them. And the only way that they survive is through each other, is through supporting each other. And some family, and they're lucky in a way, I think, because again, I don't know the insides of their family, but I get a sense that they have been able to somehow kind of take care of each other and support each other through this. And I wanted that in this book. I wanted that for Claudia. I wanted everything goes wrong for her, but what sort of, there's no bow at the end of the book, right? But at all. And actually a lot of reviewers have pointed out that it doesn't really have the sort of, not a happy ending, but satisfying ending. And I was like, yeah, there's not really a satisfying ending for something like this. But I think that the best kind of justice people can get, is having the support of their family and their community. And often that means the support of other people who've either been victimized in the same way or their families have been victimized in the same way. And it's just about, like you said this at the beginning, listening, being listened to, right? So talking about that family member that's gone, or or talking about whatever they survived, that is the only way that I've seen that people find some measure of peace. But I think that the bottom line is that when violence infects your life like this, it's never going to not infect your life. It's always going to be inside you and inside your family, and you have to figure out a way to deal with it. And I hope that, I was just talking to, was it you? No, who was I talking to? So we were talking about the sort of defund the police movement, and how the idea is that, that there are things that the police have no real business doing, and giving counseling to victims is just not really something that police frankly should be tasked with doing. So if we could take some money and put that into victims advocates, into more community, programs of, trauma recovery in communities, that I think is the kind of stuff, and helping keeps families together too, right? That also is about childcare. It's also about supportive housing. It's about healthcare, keeping families so that they can support each other is I think the only way that people really get any kind of real justice. Because I don't think we hear this a lot, families whose, a family member's been murdered, somebody gets the death penalty. That's supposed to be like the ultimate justice. Nobody feels better. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, and again, it's focus on a punishment, on this retribution. It's not on healing.
Right.
Again, whether or not a person, either a person who's lost a loved one to violence, or a person who's experiencing sexual violence wants something. I mean, every survivor has a different perspective, but there have been so many really wonderful pieces written about precisely how incarceration does not bring this closure to so many survivors of color. So again, what does it mean to imagine otherwise? But what does it also mean to invest in our communities and invest in survivors? And what survivors want? I mean, for starters, care and support, is something that, again, shouldn't be radical. And in closing, I would just want to give you some space to talk about what you want readers to take from this book. If one thing.
Right. I mean, honestly, like, one of the big things for me is just that, like, getting drunk does not mean that you deserve to get raped. Like, I feel like that is like for a lot of people, that's kind of a radical belief. Like that, like, oh, she got too drunk. What did she expect? Like that, there are way too many people who think that. Like, that is not an acceptable belief, in my opinion. And I mean, that's kind of the main thing at some level. But I think also I want people to, one of the things, we didn't really talk about this that much, but one of the things that was important to me in this book too was the connection that Claudia has with her sister, and the way that her sister realizes pretty quickly that she let Claudia down at a moment when Claudia really, really needed her. And I think that there's a level of wanting people to sort of look at themselves and their families and the people in their lives and sort of say, am I giving people a break? Like, Claudia needed a break. Yeah, she got drunk and something horrible happened to her. Like, instead of just, even her family assumed, like, she just, she's probably passed out in some guy's bed. Even her family assumed the worst. And I think that, like, a lot of us, especially young people, need a break. Give us the benefit of the doubt. Give us. I'm no longer a young person. But it's hard to be. It's hard to be a woman. It's hard to be a man. It's hard to, like, this is a complicated world, and I think we need to. Nobody gives Claudia a break in this book, and she really, really needs it. And I think we should be giving each other breaks when we can.
I think so much about where we are right now, surviving a pandemic, and it's something that I tell my students very often, that it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm not going to gaslight you. We are still in a pandemic. Things are still not okay.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing that as an educator, setting that as the foundation for our discussion has made students feel safer, right?
Yeah.
And I think that when someone experiences violence, I think in particular as a young person, there's this expectation that they know what they want, that they know what happened to them.
Right.
And they just don't. I mean, most people who experience some violence, I mean, we don't know what we want. I mean, for starters, we want it to not have happened. But if that can't happen, then what does justice look like? And I will say that a decade in between, where I was when I met you and where I am now, there's a lot of things that I would think differently. But I think for starters, I wish I would have told myself it's okay to not jump head first into trying to solve this problem, right? Because I mean, I was 20 years old, right?
Yeah.
And I sometimes mourn that 20-year-old and the fact that she had to know what she wanted.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, you don't get to be a kid anymore. So I mean, what I would want for Claudia and what I would want for young people who are unfortunately in this situation is that it's okay to be that age. It's okay to not know what you want.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, they age us when we experience violence.
Totally. Oh, super! It's always a super enlightening or super uplifting conversation when I talk about the books that I've written. But do people have questions?
Yes. So the first question says, how did you navigate through writing such a sensitive topic?
Well, I'm not sure exactly if you mean, like, okay. I had some people read the book that had been victims of sexual violence, and some men too, because I wanted to make sure I was sort of portraying male sexuality and male experience a little. So I used my, I mean, although I have not had exactly what Claudia happened to me, I have had some ugly experiences, and I might, with all my, and my friends have too, and I mine that to write. I also, this is what I love about being the difference between being a reporter and being a fiction writer, is that I really get to like imagine and use like my empathy muscle. I can really like close my eyes and really try to be who these people are and try to imagine what they are and try to be as truthful about that as I can. I think that a lot of people who are either crime reporters or mystery novelists, or frankly cops or ER doctors, have like a chip missing, where and Andrea probably has this a little bit too, like we spend our lives focused on and learning about and thinking about really dark stuff, but somehow we're able to break that focus on occasion and have a sense of peace in our normal lives. I don't know how to answer that other than to say that like I must have a weird chip missing that allows me to think about really dark stuff and still be okay. I don't know if that answered the question, but is there any more? Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yes. So the second question is, was there a specific case you took inspiration from, or was it just a compilation of what you've read in the past?
Well, it was the Steubenville case, like I talked about in the beginning. It was a little bit of, frankly, Andrea's case. And like just, yeah, and then just a compilation of like over and over and over, you see one of the cases that initially it was mentioned in an early draft of the book, and now I'm going to forget her name. But there was a woman at Columbia University. It was probably right around when Andrea did your Title IX lawsuit. What is her name? The woman they call
Emma Silkowitz.
Emma Silkowitz. Yes. So
Emma
she
Silkowitz
was
about a year after. Yeah.
About a year after you. So she was assaulted as a student at Columbia, and justice was not served. But long story short, she became sort of somebody that I knew about and a lot of people knew about because she created an art project called Carry This Weight, where basically she, for an entire, I think it was semester, carried everywhere she went a mattress, a dorm mattress, to sort of represent where she had been assaulted. And she carried it to class. She carried it all over. I think she was on the cover of New York Magazine at one point. And it was so powerful because it was like this perfect illustration of the weight that a survivor carries every minute of the day. She was literally having to lug this mattress around. And what was so beautiful about it was that sometimes other people would help her carry it or carry it for her. And like, that's we're talking about like what is justice? It's the support of your community, right? Sometimes she got that, but then sometimes she had to carry it by herself. And I like that case, or that story was also really inspiring. Like I said, in an early draft, I actually had Claudia mention that, and then it sort of didn't end up making the final.
She might not have been old, maybe a little bit. Like I think
right. She wouldn't have known. She would have like read about it, but she would have been a kid when it happened.
Would have been in middle school, which is crazy.
Yeah. I know, right?
So we have another one. It says, this is not really a question, it's more of a comment, but I really liked how you placed the emphasis, especially during this conversation, about drinking not being equal to, I guess, like being, responsible for the thing. And thank you so much for the ending of the book. I really liked it. And I know you mentioned that some people didn't like it, like the reviewers, but I thought it really tied everything up together and placed everything back into Claudia's hands. Thank
you. I wrote that ending probably like 5 different ways. It was really hard to it's always hard to end a book, and I think as a reader, a lot of times, I think a lot of novels, it's hard to end a book. It's hard to figure out where, because every character story could continue into perpetuity, right? And figuring out where to cut off the plot and make it, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be like a perfect circle, but it does have to, I think, as a reader, I want an ending that feels satisfying, right? But what does satisfying mean? Like, I was satisfied with the ending of The Sopranos, and a lot of people hated that, right? I loved it. I was like, perfect, but like, I hesitate. I'm sorry I even mentioned reviews, because like reviews are reviews, but I will be interested to see how people react to the ending, because it is like not a, everybody goes to jail and like we float off into the sunset.
I will say also that I think we're too accustomed to happy endings when it comes to crime stories.
Totally.
That is just not the case. And I will say that I think that the average person who has read anything about my story thinks that I have like an immediate happy ending. But like what has not been told is like everything that I lost. For starters, my 20s.
Right.
Literally the entirety of my 20s, I grew up very, very, very fast. I was unable to go back to being a student again. I really wanted to go to graduate school, but I didn't graduate on time because I was doing this activist work, which was in part because, I wanted to do it, but also because it was in many ways a survival. So like all of these things, all these parts that we lose of ourselves, the relationships in my family that just weren't the same because of this big secret that I wasn't talking about. These are all things we don't hear about these things. Like, even in my case where like, I got justice and that UNC was found responsible for violating Title IX. Sexual violence is still happening at UNC. It has not stopped because of Title IX complaint. Also, UNC is one of the thousands of universities in this country that experience sexual violence. It has not stopped. I still hear many cases very much just like the ones that we engage in our complaint happening right now. So again, what is justice? Right. I will say that what is different now around campus sexual violence and sexual violence more broadly is that we are hearing more about it. And there are more people who have come forward. So people feel a little less alone. Whether or not that is going to dramatically transform a person's survivor journey, can't really be measured. But I will say, and you can say too, Julia, is that more people are talking about this than they were 10 years ago.
10 years ago. Yeah. Yeah.
And that is the difference.
Mm-hmm.
And then one question we always like to ask our guests for every event is, what are you currently reading?
Okay. So I actually just finished a book by a guy I know who's an LA Times reporter named James Quealy. It's called All These Ashes. And I'm a sucker for reporter books. But James is great because he's been a crime reporter. He was in Newark for a while, and now he's in LA, and he's a really good reporter. But he also, and so he really, in a way, and I think this is like to our talk about justice, right? He understands all the flaws and limitations of the justice system. And so he writes about that in his fiction. So I just finished that, and that actually comes out, I think it comes out next week. It's called All These Ashes. But the other book that I recently finished that I just loved is, and this is also a book about violence. Everything I read is about violence. It's by actually a friend of mine named Catherine Dykstra, who wrote a book about, kind of vaguely a true crime book, but it's really kind of more than that, called What Happened to Paula. And it's about a young woman, an 18-year-old girl in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who was found murdered in 1970. And it's about Katie's investigation into that murder. And I'll just say that it's this is 50 years ago. It is extremely timely what happened to this girl. And it's really, it's like angry. It makes me angry that what happened to her in that year could absolutely happen to a young woman now. So that's called What Happened to Paula.
Do you want to know my opinion? I'm a graduate student. I'm reading once a week. But I would say the book that I keep coming back to both in my work and also I read it with my friends is Mariam Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us. If anyone wants to engage more in what a world without police, what an abolitionist world can look like, I would say it's an incredible first start. And I would say in terms of more fiction, I'm reading One Last Stop, which I love. I also just love lesbian fiction.
What is that? Casey McKinton?
Yeah.
Is that who that wrote One Last Stop?
Yeah.
That's like, yes,
Absolutely
yes,
wonderful. I have a whole other like life dream of just doing like teen fiction as a way to work through social issues.
I mean that like, well, we like, it's funny. So YA fiction, right? So young adult, right? Some people have even said that The Missing Hours is like a little bit young adult because the main character is 19. And I think that like there's a line straddle there. Like I wouldn't necessarily think a 14-year-old should read it, but certainly like a 17-year-old could read it and feel like they were getting something. But I too am a huge YA fan. Thank you,
So
Rachel.
we're about. Sorry.
No. I just saw a nice note from Wendy and Rachel, and so I'm saying thank you. And Sandy, those great, lovely notes. Thank you.
So we're about to close out the event, and I'd like to end with a few reminders. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Missing Hours, you can find it on our website, in our store, or just click the buy button down below. If you missed some of our conversation tonight or would like to share it with a friend, which I highly recommend, you can find it recorded on Crowdcast, and in a few days it will be up in our new YouTube channel. And finally, please keep an eye out for other upcoming events in our weekly newsletter and on our website. Again, thank you, Julia and Andrea, so much for coming by today and speaking about this wonderful book and the way it's really important to our community, especially at us at UNC. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea.
Take
Thank you
care.
so much. Bye.